This one, I've gotten this one. How can a loving God send someone to hell? And especially if we think of hell as this eternal, conscious judgment, punishment, wrath that God pours out on sinners who are finite beings, right? So even if someone said, okay, I understand that people are sinners, that people have failed. I mean, most people would say, yeah, I'm not perfect. But they would say, I still have only committed so many sins. Why should I be punished for eternity? And especially when you compare that with John 3:16, God loved the world. How does hell and love, how can these possibly fit together?
If we understand love as we normally understand love, I think it can make sense. So if you have a husband and a dad in his house, or he comes home and someone is ransacking his house and his wife and his kids, what is he going to do? He's going to pour his wrath out. His love for his family will compel him to act. And so this idea, so part of what we need to correct in America, love wins. And what we're seeing even in that context, the people who have been chanting love wins the most, and they hate Donald Trump. And whether you think he's a good guy or not, what you realize is this love card's kind of played as an emotional thing. So we understand the emotional weight of it, but what it ends up being ends up becoming a tool for, oh, well, you guys hate, so you're out. So you're out, you know what I mean? And so even the people who are yelling the most love wins ends up judging and excluding certain people from the conversation, you know what I mean? Kind of confined to a social hell, so to speak. You kind of get marginalized and set apart. So I would say everybody understands that love must discriminate in the sense that it recognizes good and evil, and love compels you to push against something. So if you love justice, you'll hate injustice. And if you love your neighbor, you'll hate racism. So you want to, your love is going to compel you to oppose the opposite. So same thing with Yahweh. So he loves his world. So it's reasonable that his love for his world will compel him to oppose those things that are destructive of it. So lying is destructive of, it rips apart social fabric, and it rips apart our relationships with one another, it rips apart even meaning and language and everything else. So since God is truth and God loves the truth, I would say it's incumbent upon him to push back against all liars. And I'd question whether or not he's really loving if he's not judging the murderer and the liar and the rapist and whatever crimes you want to put out there. Would we really say, so if you have a governor in California who's like, oh, I love my son, and the son's shooting up campuses or whatever it is, he's like, but I love him, we would say, what a grossly unjust governor. And yet when it comes to God, we say you're grossly unjust that you're going to judge. So I think we should all agree, at least, and that doesn't get us to the eternality of hell and what the nature of hell is, but it should at least from the word go be on the table that a loving being judges, and a loving being discriminates, and a loving being pours his wrath out on evil. I don't think those ideas are mutually exclusive. Now, the idea that it becomes eternal, even in our own justice system, we understand that some crimes are a little slap on the wrist, other crimes, and you get bigger. If I was to assault you, one thing happens. If I go after the president, another thing happens. But now if you assault Yahweh and you seek to usurp him and his kingdom, if you seek to overthrow the United States government, they're going to put you down. If you seek to overthrow Yahweh's rule and reign over all things, he's going to put you down. And that's the thing that we kind of hate. We hate the idea that Yahweh would rule and reign over us and have an authority over us, because we want to be, original sin. We want to determine good and evil for ourselves and not allow him to determine it. So I would say that the nature of God and his being and his love compels him to judge the world. And I would want to say two things regarding the eternality of it. One, we don't grasp the nature of our eternity. It's so common for us to lie. It's so common for people to deceive. It's so common for there to be immorality that we're not a morally serious culture. And so it's hard to really think that something's really, really evil. You know what I mean? Even as Christians, we kind of wink at sort of sins and stuff like that. And so I would just say the minute we grasp the weightiness of transgressing Yahweh, then he judges us. And I'd also want to say I'm not persuaded that the person in hell's heart is changed. And so part of going to hell is, God says, don't harden your heart as they did in the desert. Even Pharaoh in the Old Testament hardens his heart. So when you get thrown into hell and God's judging you, it's not like you're like, oh man, big mistake, I'm sorry. You gnash your teeth at Yahweh, and you're probably still declaring him unjust, and you're still declaring him mean and evil and everything else. So you still hate Yahweh, you know what I mean? You still hate God. So So the eternality of it is, I would kind of say there's a sense in which your rebellion against God doesn't stop. And so you are rebellious for all eternity, and your heart is hardened for all eternity. So it's not like you suddenly stop being a sinner in hell and you begin to love Yahweh and you begin to love the good. Actually, hell solidifies you in your hatred of God and in your anxiety towards God and everything else. And that's why you weep and gnash your teeth at them. And so, what the exact nature of hell is, I'm willing to say I don't know. I think the Bible gives us some pictures. I don't think those pictures have to be necessarily literal sorts of things. And so, is it outer darkness, or is it fire, or is it, what exactly is it? I'm not sure. Is there worms there? Or, all these sorts of things. I think it's pretty horrible. Whatever it is, it's a horrible judgment. But at the end of the day, my disposition towards God is one of trust, and I trust that He is just. But if you also think about the nature of the question, it's kind of a subtle irony, is because the person raising the objection is usually the naturalist, says life is meaningless. We came from nothing. We go to nothing. How can this happen to humanity? Humanity is so meaningful, and so they want there to be some sort of image of God in man and make man something special is the only way that it could possibly be unjust. You know what I mean? So, and which again brings us back into a Christian system of what's the nature of man. I would just say if naturalism is true, whether there's a fire, it just is. There are no oughts. And so the nature of the question, I would also push us back in the context of Christianity. There is a just world, that justice must account, whether it's God being held accountable in justice, like He can't do such a horrible thing as send people to hell, that's unjust, or if it's God holding humanity accountable for His behavior and it being just. So I think even the nature of the question brings us back into a moral order, which I think brings us into a God. Yeah. And I would argue the God of Christianity particularly is what the nature of that objection brings us to. It doesn't make sense in the context of atheism and agnosticism.
Right, yeah. And going back to applying that the standard, your own standard to different worldviews, if someone says, well, you think God is love, on your worldview, He shouldn't send people to hell. That's a misunderstanding of. So it's a theological misunderstanding. God is all of His attributes. It's not like He is mostly love and partly justice and partly righteous and partly holy. Instead, He is love, He is just, He is righteous, He is holy. And so that's the proper understanding of Christianity. And so the Bible is teaching not that God is love sometimes and He's just sometimes, but rather He is love and He's just at the same time.
Yeah.
And these do not contradict each other, but they work together.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty key that we tie those things in, because oftentimes we'll say He is loving, but, and we set that but against, like, as if He's got like a split personality, but His holiness is loving, you know what I mean? And His love is holy, and His justice is loving, and all these things are intertwined. So it's not like, oh yeah, God is loving, but He's also, all those things are one, and He brings all those to the table in every instance, in every moment that we're interacting with Him, and it actually becomes pretty glorious.